Okay, so yeah, a couple of games released this week which we weren't able to take a look at. I guess Mafia, the old country, just didn't receive a review code for some reason. Um, we'll be taking a look at that when we can. Another game that did come out, Apex Legends on Switch 2, which looks quite intriguing, right, Oliver?
It does. And this is a game that actually surprised me quite a bit in terms of its quality this week. So I'm quite happy to talk about it here in this direct. So if we compare the Switch 2 version and the Switch 1 version here, the first thing that stands out is there's like a huge improvement in image quality, a pretty gargantuan improvement in image quality. As you might expect, that's not too surprising, but it is pretty special here. The original game clocked in at a dynamic 720p with TAA. That was Tom's measurement. It's also my measurement in this code as of the moment. And the Switch 2 counts in at 1080p in the shots I tested. And I think it's using a DLSS variant here because it doesn't resemble the TAA used in other versions of the game at all. And it has some DLSS-like characteristics. It looks much better than the old code. It's no longer blurry. It's easy to read visually, which is very important for a multiplayer shooter like this. There's minimal aliasing. It's just a dramatically better appearance. I don't think it's upsampling necessarily with DLSS though to a much higher resolution because it's not terribly sharp at all. It looks like a 1080p like presentation, and the UI also appears like a 1080p like UI here. Then there are a ton of settings upgrades on top of that, so there are better quality, better filtered soft shadows here, much higher grade textures. There's good SSAO that is used extensively for the game's indirect lighting. There's extra ground clutter, there's more foliage, and the foliage that is there animates, whereas before it was totally static. There's better draw distances, and there's better reflections that use cube maps more extensively. There's no SSR here, or certainly anything more exotic or exciting like ray tracing. We're still waiting for that implementation on Switch to occur here, but overall it's a stunning visual difference. And then in terms of performance, on Switch 1, it targeted only 30 FPS and it often missed it. It would tend to struggle, especially at this beginning of matches when you're kind of flying down in that big aerial formation. It really kind of collapsed the performance there.
Right.
Combat could also be a big problem. Again, this game has like huge matches, 60-player matches. It was not performing too well at all times there. Switch 2 is nearly a lock 60 FPS in comparison. The only exceptions are like at the beginning of the match, it would drop down to like, the 40s and 50s, nothing too bad. There'd be some one-off frame drops during matches as well, but nothing too bad at all. It was generally a lock 60 FPS, which is really important, obviously, in that docked output. Compared to Series S, I was even more surprised when I looked at Series S because it looks very similar to Series S. The biggest visual difference by far has got nothing to do with the game settings. It's just a difference in gamma. So the Switch 2 version is a little bit lighter for whatever reason. And if you darken those shadows in post-production, you can actually get them to match a little bit more, which is a little bit of a weird difference that we saw, I think, in the original Switch version as well. It's a little bit lighter than the existing home console versions of the game. There's some cutbacks in Switch 2, like there's less ground clutter, shadow resolution's lower, shadow pop-in's a little bit worse. Nothing too major here. And a lot is very similar, like pop-in for geometry, pop-in for models is quite similar. So there are a couple cutbacks, but I think the key change here comes down to image quality, where Switch 2 is just doing a much better job of actually resolving a clean and stable 1080p-like image. Both consoles are 1080p 60. The Series S also counts to 1080p, but the Switch 2 is just running a lot better here, looking a lot better in that 1080p 60 mode. The Series S also has a 120 hertz mode that I didn't have time to test that compromises a little bit more in resolution. And the Switch 2, in terms of 120 hertz support, it does not have any 120 hertz support whatsoever. So it's just a 60 hertz output only game. I also looked briefly at portable mode, and it runs really well at 60 FPS there as well. It does have VRR support, but the VRR appears to drop below 40 hertz or so. So at like the beginning of those big matches, I did feel it drop out of the VRR range quite noticeably there, but otherwise it's within the VRR range. The developers say it's going to 1008p, so just below 1080p, and it does look relatively 1080p-like, relatively sharp on the display. Internally, it's something like 720p is what I counted, so it is upsampling there to a higher resolution, presumably using DLSS. So I was just as a bit of a takeaway, I was super surprised here and very pleased because Switch 2 is obviously pulling off much better visuals than Switch 1. That's no surprise. And it is a
Yeah.
dramatic improvement. But the comparison to Series S was really quite something here. Series S is running a more demanding set of settings, obviously, but Switch 2 is arguably the preferable platform, at least in that 60 hertz mode, because it is pulling off much better image quality along a number of axes with the use of DLSS. And I'm really pleased here. So I think this is a case where they're going back to a game that is a little bit older. Apex is a 6-year-old game. It's obviously based on the very, very old Source engine at this point. So maybe it's not the best barometer for the application of, current gen rendering tech necessarily. But it does look a lot better on Switch 2 than I think it has any right to, realistically, considering what they're trying to pull off here. It's quite impressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what was the Series S versus Switch 2 pixel counts in the docked mode?
1080p flat on both. Now, of course, it's possible, and indeed probably likely based on the pedigree of the other versions, the Switch 2 version might have DRS here, and that might be more aggressive than other versions, right? That's entirely possible here. But in terms of the pixel count, both were coming out at native 1080p.
It's pretty impressive, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the great thing about when a new console comes along, getting to grips with what it's actually capable of, because obviously in the pre-release period, you've got access to limited media and you've got, leaked specs, leaked developer documentation, that kind of thing. But at the same time, it's like, well, you don't really know what these things are truly capable of until you actually get shipping software in your hands. And that's where some surprises come up, right? I mean, obviously, going back in the day to like 2020, we were expecting the Series X to outperform the PlayStation 5 based on the specifications that were released. But it actually turns out there's a lot more to a console than just, how many compute units or it's got or its core clock frequency. There's particularly in a fixed platform environment for a console, it's just very, very different. And it's actual games that do the talking. I don't know what you think of these assets there, Alex.
Oh, it's interested from me to see the areas where it does dip below, and it kind of talks a little bit to the area we're probably going to see this generation where Switch 2 has its greatest challenges in the CPU area.
Yeah.
So that's always interesting to see from my perspective. It would be kind of fun to take that and translate that using like-for-like performance to a PC unit and kind of see, while jumping into a match, we can get the frame rate down to this. What PC CPU is that most similar to performance-wise in this exact moment? And I think we could actually chart that. And that's something that would be a fun video almost in its own right, to look at how we can chart what are most likely CPU-limited areas in games and Switch, and what as the most equivalent PC CPU that we can kind of put that against.
What I'd love to see is 3D Mark basically becoming console developers.
There's nothing actually stopping them.
I'm curious about that, right?
We should maybe send them a message one day, like, why don't you just release your benchmark on the people release, junkware all the time on the consoles that could do anything. Maybe they just feel like it's bad form or something like that.
Well, yeah, if you can produce a highly contentious, possibly illegal version of Wipeout for the Xbox.
Yeah, really, right? Like if you can do that, like why not just port a benchmark?
Yeah, of course. The stuff we've seen on the eShop, the shovelware part of the eShop, basically seems to be the case that anything goes, right? Why not a nice bit of benchmarking software? That would be pretty awesome. But Apex Legends, it's great to see that game actually getting a really good port for Switch 2 there. And I'm going to say it again, and I must apologize, but at some point, yes, we will look at Fortnite on Switch 2. It's just things have been a bit busy at the moment. But I suspect there'll be some nice surprises there too, bearing in mind it's targeting 60 frames per second. But just have to wait and see.